So about a year ago, prominent atheist Alex O'Connor came out a video called "This is Why I Don't Believe in God." And considering the significance of a title like that, I thought this video would be a good one to address and to respond to. So without further ado, let's get into Alex O'Connor's reasons for not believing in God.
I will not be asking you to look in ancient scripture, nor to the beginning of the universe, nor indeed down a microscope, instead just to your direct experience of the world and facts about the lives of people within it. I will, however, indulge in a brief biblical recital because I want to begin with a reading from the book of Psalms. So if you could all turn to Psalm 139, unless, of course, you've already committed this famous passage to memory. Verse 7 onwards reads, "Where can I go from your presence? Or where can I flee from your spirit? If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths of the Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall guide me, and your right hand shall hold me fast." This poem in its entirety is given by the NRSV a title, "The Inescapable God." It's a message of bold reassurance to the believer, reminding them that since God is present everywhere, pervading every inch of our universe, he is, in the happiest sense possible, inescapable.
First, I just want to say at the start of this how much I really respect Alex O'Connor. I just noticed something on this watch through of this video that I didn't notice before, and that's that he has that passage from Psalms partially memorized. I think at least like 2/3 of what he just read he didn't look down at while reading, which is really impressive for a live debate like that. So I just wanted to get that off at the start. I really respect this guy. He's smart and he's intellectually honest, which is awesome. That being said, I want to clarify right off at the start, too, what this passage he reads from Psalms is and is not talking about. Like you mentioned, it's talking about the idea that God is omnipresent. God is present everywhere you go. This idea derives from the notion of God as existence himself, or existence itself, because if God's existence itself, then existence is present wherever things exist, so God must be present wherever things exist. It's an objective claim about the nature of God and about the nature of the world, and that God exists wherever you go. Now, I say this to start off because as we get into this video, I think we'll see that implicitly, he never says it explicitly, but implicitly, Alex seems to take this notion of God's omnipresence to entail something like a notion that God's existence must be obvious, or everyone needs to know that God exists in order for God to exist. He seems to take this notion of God's omnipresence and something that Christians have historically understood as an objective statement about God to be more of a subjective statement about all of us being able to need to feel God's omnipresence in order for God to be omnipresent. So just keep that in mind as we go forward.
But my first argument, and it's going to be the first of three, against the viability of theism flows from the demonstrable fact that this divine consolation is seemingly not offered universally, and often in fact restricted from those who want it the most.
Yeah, so here, omnipresence, God's omnipresence is not fundamentally a consolation. It's just a statement about God. You could take it in a consoling manner. It's sometimes consoling to know for the believer that everywhere you go, there God is. You can't escape his domain. But again, that's an objective statement. It's not saying, this passage is not saying that in order for God to exist, it needs to be obvious wherever you go that he exists. So
I'm going to be making the claim specifically that atheism or naturalism provides a better account for three facts of our universe. The first being the hiddenness of God. The second being the geographical, statistical arrangement, shall we say, of religious belief. And the third will be the problem of gratuitous suffering, and we'll see if we get time to finish it off. Far from being unable to escape God, there is a very real contingent of non-believers, and I would count myself among their number, who are unable by any means to discover him, who seek and do not find, who knock and receive, as it were, no answer. This strange phenomenon is known as the problem of divine hiddenness. If there is a God, then simply, why is he hidden from so many of us so much of the time? If theism is to offer a sufficient account of reality, then it must offer an account of what J.L. Schellenberg has famously labelled non-resistant non-belief, which he distinguishes from resistant non-belief. It's sometimes said by a theist who wishes to explain the problem of divine hiddenness that people simply disbelieve through their own fault. they're too stubborn. They're purposefully blinding themselves to the evidence because they don't want it to be true. They're not approaching the arguments honestly with an open heart, and that if they would only do this, then God would surely reveal himself. Such a person would be what Schellenberg calls a resistant non-believer. He disbelieves, in some sense, because he actively resists it.
For the record, that's not the approach I take, as I hope will become clear in a second.
He disbelieves, in some sense, because he actively resists it. For what it's worth, I do think that such people exist. I think many such people exist. There are people who come to this debate with their minds already made up. There are people who want it not to be true, that God exists, and in fact wouldn't submit to that truth even if it were true. There was a recent poll run by the Atheist Experience YouTube channel, which I know, Jonathan, you're a fan of, which asked, if there was a God, would you worship it? To which an astonishing 85% of respondents said that they would not. There are, however, also people who disbelieve in God, not out of resistance or stubbornness or a hardened heart, but rather due to sheer lack of conviction. Indeed, many such people actively want to be convinced of God's existence and would jump at the chance of entering into a relationship with him if they thought that he did. But no matter how hard they search, they simply find no answer forthcoming from the heavens, and this is the non-resistant non-believer.
And again, I have no reason to doubt that such people exist. If someone comes up to me and says that he wants to believe in God, he just doesn't think that theism is true, I'm going to take him at face value.
Formally, then, Schellenberg's problem of divine hiddenness can be stated as follows. Premise 1. If there is a God, he is perfectly loving, something I'm pretty sure Jonathan agrees with. Premise 2. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise 3. Non-resistant non-belief does occur. 4. Therefore, no perfectly loving God exists, and the conclusion from the first premise is that therefore there is no God.
So this is a valid syllogism. So if all of O'Connor's premises are true, then the conclusion follows. And like I've already said, I don't disagree with the second premise. I have no reason to doubt that someone like Alex O'Connor is sincere when he says that he has intellectual objections to the existence of God. It's the first premise I disagree with. And as we get into this video, I think it'll become clear that O'Connor doesn't really spend as much time addressing this one as he does the second premise. I think because he thinks that, to a lot of Christians, the idea that an all-loving God would want to make sure everyone who is willing knows that he exists is obvious. But I don't accept that. I mean, Alex quotes that psalm in the beginning, Psalm, I think it was 139. And implicitly, like I said, he never explicitly says it, but implicitly he seems to take that to entail the idea that an all-loving God would want to make sure that everyone knows he exists. And he seems to take that as a precept of divine revelation. I don't take it that way. Instead, I align myself more with the Catholic view, or the traditional Christian view, really, which has been the idea that the existence of God is not obvious. It's not self-evident that God exists. That was a debate in the medieval church. Anselm said that the existence of God is self-evident. Thomas Aquinas responded to him by saying, no, it's not. And I side more with Thomas Aquinas on that. I think that the existence of God is something we have to reason through by arguments, by syllogisms. And therefore, I don't see why non-resistant non-belief is incompatible with the existence of God. I don't think there's anything in Scripture that says that it should be obvious that God exists. I don't think there's anything in philosophy that says that it should be obvious that God exists. So someone like Alex O'Connor, his mistake, if he has a mistake at all, it's an intellectual mistake, not a moral mistake. Actually, I would say he has a mistake. It's an intellectual one. He's in the same category as someone who believes that the Earth is flat, or if aliens did exist, all of us who think that aliens don't exist. It's an intellectual mistake he's making, and we should treat his mistake as an intellectual one, not a moral one.
A loving God, like the Christian God, would surely not refuse any willing person from developing a relationship with him, and so if somebody is truly non-resistant and open to receiving God's grace, we should expect them to receive it. Thus, Schellenberg's assertion that if God exists, then non-resistant non-belief does not exist. The question, then, is there such a thing as non-resistant non-belief, a non-resistant non-believer?
And to the objection that says that God can't have a personal relationship with someone who doesn't know that he exists, I would just say that at a certain point in his life, Alex O'Connor will come to know that God exists. I would say certainly it would happen when he dies. And if Alex O'Connor tries to live a morally upright life using the voice of conscience he has in his head, I don't see any reason to suspect that he wouldn't right now be baptized with what Catholics call the baptism of desire. Basically, if you really, really, through no fault of your own, can't know some truth of the Catholic faith, and you don't accept Catholicism for that reason, then you're in a sense already in the church, not externally, but internally, because you're predisposed to accept the truths of the Catholic faith if you knew they were true. That's the same reason why someone on a deserted island who never heard the gospel can be saved, because he's predisposed to accept Christianity if he ever heard it. He just hasn't heard it. And I would think someone like Alex would be in that kind of situation.
Is there such a thing as non-resistant non-belief, a non-resistant non-believer? To which all I can really say is nice to meet you. The last time I debated Jonathan a number of years ago, when I was just a few months out of being a teenager, I said that even if I found Christianity to be true, I still wouldn't want to worship the God that it promotes. I now, since then, have realized how irrational and self-defeating this assertion is, and stand before you today as an example of a non-resistant non-believer. I think it would be great if God existed. I really do. I would absolutely love to escape death. I would relish being the recipient of unconditional love. Less selfishly, I would love to be able to worship that which deserves to be worshipped. I just don't think it's true. Now, try as I might, look where I can, I find no response, no hint, nothing. I don't choose to disbelieve in God any more than I choose to disbelieve in aliens, despite how much I might want them to. So when faced with a psalm like Psalm 139, I'm overwhelmed with a sense not of beauty and consolation, but envy and disappointment. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Where can I go, I should ask in response, to find it? Of course, you cannot know my heart. You can't know if I'm truly as non-resistant as I claim, but I hope that my actions here might betray me.
First of all, I really have to respect Alex for exposing himself like this, just kind of laying out his whole personal how he's doing in life thing. It takes guts. That being said, I don't think that anything that he's said so far about his own personal life, or anything that he's going to say after this point in his personal attempt to try to discover the existence of God, disproves the existence of God. Because like I said, I don't think that non-resistant non-belief, even sincere, honest, non-resistant non-belief, is incompatible with the existence of God. So let's get into what else he has to say.
As a Catholic child, I was once an altar boy. I would serve the altar of Mother Church every Sunday dressed in a white robe. In the time since then, I have, to put it mildly, been looking for God. I went to Catholic schools. I studied philosophy and theology at A-levels. I made a career out of engaging with religious arguments. I have explored arguments from contingency, from fine-tuning, from motion, from mathematics, from irreducible complexity and the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. It may surprise my followers online to learn that at university I visited numerous churches on the invitation of various friends. I spent hours talking with religious friends until the sun rose again, if you like. I attended Bible groups regularly too, which might surprise people as well. And in fact, I still do attend such groups. Just recently, I agreed to embark on a series of study of the wisdom literature, specifically reading it again in the hopes that this time I might finally feel a divine presence seeping from between the lines. I moved into a house for a year with 2 devoutly Christian housemates, with the express intention of seeing if the obvious truth of Christianity and theism that people like to talk about can be found in the minutiae of daily life.
Again, I'm not saying that the truth of Christianity is obvious. I'm saying it's something you have to reason to. And just for the record, half the stuff that Alex mentions here, I don't think are actually good indicators of trying to discover the Christian faith. Like being an altar server as a kid, I was never an altar server, but I knew a lot of altar servers, and you don't get a lot of theology a lot of times doing that, or going to Catholic school is another one like that. But a lot of other things that he's mentioned so far, and a lot of the things that he's about to mention, I think are actually good indicators of really trying to dive into the arguments of the existence of God. So I'll address those when we come to them.
I have looked, in other words, in a great deal of places. I read Athanasius and Anselm. I read Augustine and Aquinas. I looked in Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena. I looked at the sociological origin of religious belief in Durkheim and Marx and Freud and Jung. I looked at religious experience in William James and Rudolf Otto. I've looked in the modern works of people like Ed Feser and Bill Craig and Michael Murray and Richard Swinburne and Alvin Plantinga. I've looked in poetry. I've looked in the Psalms. I've looked in Job. I've looked in Ecclesiastes. I've looked in Dostoevsky. I read C.S. Lewis. I listened to worship music. I prayed. I studied the gospel. I even got an actual degree in theology from a university. And nothing, not once, not nearly, not ever, not even briefly have I experienced anything that speaks to the existence of a God in the universe.
So in other words, this guy's really smart. And you might be saying, look, Thomas, you say that non-resistant non-belief isn't incompatible with the existence of God. You're using kind of a problem of evil explanation, kind of applying like Thomas Aquinas' answer to the problem of evil, that God could permit evil, or the existence of evil to allow for greater good. You're doing a similar thing with saying that God could permit people not knowing about him to bring about greater goods, like people being able to think about, people being able to do what Alex and I are doing right now and going back and forth on the existence of God. And you might say, well, that's all well and good, but what about someone like Alex Connor? He's gone above and beyond. How can God allow that much hiddenness? And I would say that I would answer with a similar method again as the problem of evil. I would say that just like with the problem of evil, sometimes we can't place our finger on what exactly the greater good is that God is trying to bring about by allowing evils like hurricanes or cancer to exist. But we can know that we're finite and he's infinite, so he has an infinite greater grasp of the results and consequences of anything that happens here on earth than we do. So maybe even if we can't see the results of allowing evil to exist or the results of allowing non-resistant non-belief to exist, God can. And if God can, then he can permit that evil to exist to bring about a greater good. And again, just because Alex O'Connor hasn't been able to reason his way onto an understanding that God exists, it doesn't mean that he's damned. He very well, considering everything he just said, could be in a spiritual positioning where he would instantly accept God after his death. And I have no reason to doubt that. So I don't see this as an objection to the idea of an all-loving God.
I think it's asking a lot of any atheist to seriously engage with a religion that he does not believe is true in any circumstances. But I feel like I have gone above and beyond what can be reasonably expected of any atheist who wishes to entertain the God hypothesis, and for my effort I have been awarded radio silence. The inescapable God of the NRSV, in other words, is for me the invisible God, or the inapproachable God, the deaf, distant God. The best account that I can give of this experience, of complete and utter silence from deaf heaven, is that all that truly exists to me is impersonal space and air and rocks. I know, it sucks. I'm sorry. It's a shame, but there's no need to cry about it. And nothing more. My question to Jonathan, then, is simple. How can theism account for this lived experience? How can it account, in other words, for non-resistant non-belief?
By saying that God allows evil, God allows people not knowing about him in order to bring about a greater good. And that Alex's evil isn't a moral evil, but an intellectual evil. It's an intellectual mistake. And therefore, it should be treated like any other intellectual mistake. The question Alex is asking is just the same as the question, why does God allow flat earthism to exist? Or why does God allow conspiracy theories to exist? Or something like that. We can point to reasons why that could be. I've already mentioned one, that maybe he likes intellectual debates and he wants to see those kind of things continue. But there's probably thousands of possible explanations that we could try to come up with. The short answer is God's infinite, we're finite. We should stop trying to put limits on his knowledge.
And if atheism, and doesn't atheism, offer a better explanation at the very least? Am I a non-resistant non-believer? If so, what offers a best account, or a better account, of such a condition? A universe in which there is a loving God who does want to be my friend, but is for some reason refusing, or hiding, or toying with me? Or a universe without one? Or is there no such thing as a non-resistant non-believer, which is the only remaining option? Do we all secretly resist in some way or other? After desperately, in other words, trying to convince myself of God's existence for years and being left painfully unconvinced, will you just submit, as if to add insult to this spiritual injury, that this is in some way my fault? And if it is, then what could I have done differently? What should I be doing differently? What could I possibly have done differently given the course of my life?
In my opinion, based on the content I've seen Alex Connor making in the last year or so, I actually think that he's getting closer than even he recognizes to accepting the existence of God. But I don't want to get into too far into that there. I would just say check out his debate with that phaser. Not debate, his conversation with that phaser. Anyway.
Now, assume for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, the alternative hypothesis of naturalism, of atheism, and ask if it provides a good account of non-resistant non-belief. And I think the answer is obvious. But it does get worse yet. You'll remember that my second fact that I said that I would bring up is the geographical predictability of religious belief. Not only does theism need to account for non-resistant non-belief, but also for the fact that such belief is unequally present across the globe. Stephen Mason has pointed out that the populace of Saudi Arabia is 95% Muslim and therefore 95% theistic, whereas the populace of Thailand is 95% Buddhist and therefore, at best, 5% theistic. How likely you are to be a theist, in other words, is intimately tied to the place in which you happen to be born. What can better explain this geographical spread? Theism or naturalism or atheism? Well, let's consider our two competing hypotheses. Could it be that God does exist, but that the Thai are simply naturally 20 times more likely to be resistant to belief in God than, say, the Saudis? Are they just naturally 20 times more stubborn or something? This seems implausible. This doesn't seem to be their fault.
Right, I don't think that's a good explanation at all.
Okay, so maybe then it's not their fault, and God just has some reason to hide his face disproportionately more from the Thai than from Saudis, or indeed from those born here in Massachusetts, which has a theistic, according to one statistic, is 75% theistic.
I love Massachusetts, but don't get me started on that.
If theism is true, it seems to me that God has a lot to answer for here. Is it not troubling, Jonathan, for as a Christian, that your place of birth is a reliable statistical indicator of how likely you are to be saved? I'll say that again. Your place of birth, which is entirely arbitrary, is a reliable indicator of how likely you are on Christianity to be saved.
We have to be careful here, because, again, not believing in the existence of God is not equivalent to not being saved. Atheism does not equal hell. And I think we need to remember that I think probably what's going on here is someone like Alex, an atheist like Alex, is hearing Christians talk about the idea of faith. And all Christians believe that faith is a necessary part of salvation. And he's probably hearing faith in God and taking that to mean faith in the existence of God. And he's hearing, if you don't believe in God, if you don't believe in the existence of God, you won't be saved. That's not what the traditional understanding of faith has been. Faith, in the traditional sense, isn't faith in the existence of God. It's not belief in the existence of God, because from a traditional Christian perspective, you can prove from reason that God exists. So it's just as much an intellectual claim as the claim that the sky is blue, or that the earth is round, or that aliens exist. What faith in God is, or what belief in God is faith or belief in the promises of God. Faith or belief in what God has promised to you. You have faith in a person. It's like if I told you that I promise that I will make a video next week, and you told me I have faith in you that you will do that. In the same way, we have faith in God when God says to us, I promise that if you trust in me and if you obey my commandments, I will give to you eternal life. That's faith in God. Faith is not in the existence of God. Belief is not in the existence of God. Faith is in the promises of God. So you are not damned necessarily if you do not accept the existence of God for intellectual reasons. That could be through no fault of your own. In that case, through baptism of desire, you could still be saved. So it is not necessarily the case that where you are born is a reliable statistical indicator of how likely you are to be saved.
You're significantly more likely to be a theist if you're born in Rwanda than if you're born in Thailand. Can this situation really obtain under the supervision of a God who wants to come to know us and makes his existence equally accessible to all? The chances seem infinitely small.
He just asserted there that God makes his existence equally obvious to all. I don't think that's necessarily the case, for reasons I've offered already.
Now consider naturalism or atheism. Religion varying by region is exactly what we would expect if it is a man-made cultural phenomenon, and nothing like what we should expect if there is, in fact, one true God who loves all equally. Again, I think atheism provides a much stronger account of this fact of our world. Finally, then, the third fact of our universe, which is gratuitous suffering. Gratuitous here means something like unjustified or unwarranted or meaningless. I do this because it's easy to see how some instances of suffering may be beneficial in certain circumstances, or necessary to bring about some desirable state of affairs, some desirable end. But the existence of meaningless or unnecessary suffering does seem to be incompatible with the existence of a God who loves us and has the power to prevent it from happening. We're sometimes told that God has morally sufficient reason to allow suffering to exist. Indeed, if God is good, then he must have such sufficient reason.
Right. What Alex just said there is the standard answer to the problem of evil. I'm sure it goes back farther than this, but the earliest I've seen it is in the writings of Thomas Aquinas. In the Summa Theologica, he answers the objection of the problem of evil by saying, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. In other words, if there's evil, God is allowing that evil to exist so that good which could not exist if that evil did not exist may one day exist. And what I would say is that even if we can't see that good that God is bringing out of that evil right now in every moment, we have no reason to doubt that it's there. So I don't think the problem of evil, stated as a logical objection, works.
Perhaps suffering is necessitated by human free will. Perhaps suffering helps to develop a person's moral character, or maybe it's necessary to achieve some other end that God wishes to bring about. But intuitively there appear to be instances of suffering that cannot serve any such end. And if even one example of these turns out to be an actual case of unnecessary or meaningless suffering, this would be enough to cause a problem.
But how in the world would you provide an example of suffering that we know can't bring about a greater good? I mean, after all, we don't see the full consequence of anything that happens here on Earth. God does, though. So God could use his infinite knowledge to see the consequence of an act of suffering that we can't see the consequence of.
I want to propose something that might sound a little strange at first, which is that the biggest problem for theism here is not, famously, the great, intense sufferings of the world, like holocausts or earthquakes, but rather menial, less significant suffering, like being caught out in the rain, or stubbing your toe, or tripping over a curb on the street. Why? It seems a tad absurd, I'll grant you that, but consider this. When we experience a great suffering, like the death of a loved one, or a devastating earthquake, or indeed a holocaust, it's easy to imagine that this might somehow be part of a grand plan. The depth of our suffering may make us into better people. The people who die may be experiencing a much happier state of affairs in the afterlife now. Perhaps by allowing the Jewish Holocaust to take place, God makes it such that we are far less likely to allow even worse projects of genocide to occur in the future. But what could possibly be served? What possible end could be served? What possible meaning could there be in stubbing your toe, or tripping over a curb, or having a pigeon use your new suit as a restroom? Such instances are not significant. They're usually forgotten within a day or two, and therefore do not and cannot develop the soul. Nor do they seem plausibly part of some grand design or plan. They seem, that is to say, meaningless and unnecessary.
I think the only reason that smaller, less significant acts of suffering strike someone like Alex as insignificant and somehow meaningless is that we never really think about the meaning behind those acts of suffering as much. I mean, we write epic poems about war, and we watch documentaries about the Holocaust and all those major acts of suffering, death, the Holocaust, things like that. We expect there to be a grand meaning there because we're always looking for it. We're always shedding tears thinking about it. Something like stubbing your toe, we just don't think about as much. That's why, as you're saying, we forget about it. But I mean, just off the top of my head, I can think of a few reasons why. Take those 3 examples he mentioned: stubbing your toe, getting caught in the rain, and there was one about, I think, like hitting a curb. I can think of reasons why God might allow all of those to exist. If you stub your toe, perhaps it'll be a reminder in the future to watch where you're going, and it'll prevent you from getting run over by a car. If you get caught in the rain, well, the crops need rain. God needs to allow rain in order to allow the natural ecosystem to exist. He's not going to like make a little vacuum around you while you're walking, because that would it would subvert his entire natural order. And why would he do that unnecessarily? Or what was that third example? Hitting your car in a curb. Well, curbs are good. Not to be trivial, but curbs serve a function. They're not God. They were man-made. They weren't made by God, but they serve a good function. And so does having a steering wheel, and so does free will, being able to turn that steering wheel into the curb. Like, we don't think about these things as much, but they do have important. We can see how they do have good things which proceed from them. And again, even if I can't point to every little good thing which will one day proceed from every little evil thing which happens here on earth, we have no reason to doubt that they exist, because God is infinite. He has infinite knowledge. He can see the consequences from our actions in a way we can't. So we should expect, really, there to be consequences, good consequences from bad things here on earth that we can't see.
They seem, that is to say, meaningless and unnecessary. More meaninglessness than instances of, let's say, great or intense suffering, much more meaningless than these. And truly meaningless, unnecessary suffering is certainly more expected in a world without benevolent supervision than in a theistic paradigm. A successful theodicy, in other words, then, needs to provide not only an account of the great and intense sufferings of the world, but also the menial sufferings which pervade the human experience.
Because Alex is concluding his remarks on the problem of evil here, I want to just quickly say something that I said on my video on the problem of evil previously on this channel. We need to remember that evil in a classical Thomistic understanding is fundamentally inferior to good, because evil is just a deficiency of good. It's an absence of good. It's like a hole in the ground. The hole's there, it's a real thing, but it's not there in a real sense, or like a crack in the plate. It's just an absence of some good that can't be there. So it's just an absence of some good that should be there. And because of that, that means that evil is dependent on good to exist. So if there's no good, there's no evil. And that should be pretty comforting for us.
Now, I'm actually quite surprised that I've made it this far without mentioning animals yet. It's quite unlike me, but that's a final consideration that does deserve our attention. Whatever theodicy might explain human suffering, the existence of animal suffering seems infinitely more difficult to explain. Animals are not free in the way that we are, and so are immune to the free will defense. They cannot morally develop in the way that we can, and so are immune to soul-making theodicies. They are, on most accounts, not going to heaven, and so they will not be compensated for their suffering. Yet their suffering is immeasurably large. Somewhere, right now, billions of animals are suffering in the wild, from predation, from disease, from hunger, from fear. Imagine a deer with its leg caught under a fallen tree, dying of starved confusion. It doesn't know why it's there. It feels hungry, it's starving to death, and it's trapped under a tree, and it has no idea why. What could possibly be the purpose or meaning of this?
But if the tree falls on the deer, and no one's around to see it, does the tree actually fall on the deer? In all seriousness, could it be that maybe God prevents that deer from suffering, and we just don't know it because we're not there to see it? And if we are there to see it, he allows it in order to bring about the greater good of us perceiving a naturally ordered world where things proceed according to natural laws that can be studied and observed and quantified, and that allows all of science to work? I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. The point is that we have no reason to think that something like that or some other explanation for God allowing evil to exist isn't there. And unless we can say with definitive certainty that here is an instance of God allowing evil, and there's absolutely no way that there could be some good that comes out of here, unless we can give an example like that, and I actually don't think it's at all possible to do so, like metaphysically possible, or epistemologically possible, I guess it would be, then without that, I don't think the problem of evil or the problem of suffering, whatever you want to call it in this case, gives us a good objection to the existence of God. Especially when, as I've argued before, we have good philosophical premise, conclusion arguments with 100% certainty, if you believe the premises are true, that argue for the existence of God.
I'll remind you that this is exactly the kind of thing that we should expect to see if the natural world is an amoral arena of accidentally existing organisms fighting with each other to stay alive. But can we really expect this on theism? Should we expect this on theism? What offers a better account? Keep in mind that, in other words, I'm not arguing that theism can offer no account of these kinds of situations and sufferings, though I am skeptical that it can. I'm only arguing that assuming that theism is false offers a better account of it than assuming that theism is true. Assume atheism. Assume that human beings and other animals are nothing more than evolved creatures who developed pain receptors to make them more prone to avoiding the menial and great sufferings that upset our survival prospects. On this account, the existence of all suffering, small and great, is not only explained, but expected. Thus, atheism offers a better account, in my view, than theism of three crucial and unavoidable facts: divine hiddenness, geographical religious statistics, and the existence of gratuitous human and non-human suffering.
And my basic answer to all three of those objections he raised would be the same. God could allow those evils of people not knowing about him, people in certain places not knowing about him, and animal suffering, or whatever kind of suffering, to exist in order to bring about greater good. And I can give examples of what I think those greater goods would be, but I think it's more profitable and more time effective just to point out that there's no reason to think that those greater goods could exist. And it doesn't make sense to try to say that they couldn't exist, since God is infinite and we're finite. God sees infinitely more than we do. He sees the consequence of anything infinitely more than we do. And again, just because someone like Alex Connor is intellectually not able to grasp the existence of God, it doesn't mean he's going to hell. It doesn't mean that. And I sure hope he's not, because he is a really interesting guy to listen to, and I'd love to talk to him about things in the afterlife. Probably wouldn't be debating the existence of God at that point, but who knows, maybe for fun. Anyway, thanks for watching this video, and please consider subscribing to this channel if you did like watching it, because at some point I've learned that YouTube starts giving you money for these things, and to a broke college kid, that would be awesome if I could make money and talk about things that I find interesting. It would give me more incentive to keep on making these videos. And if you do like these videos, then I would definitely appreciate you subscribing. Anyway, thank you for watching again, and God bless. Thank you.